Okay, we're really close to finishing now, I think. So Johnny Trot and Elizabeth's dad have been rescued, and they've been taken downstairs on the ship that's rescued them and wrapped up in warm blankets and given nice hot drinks. But they haven't found Elizabeth and her mother or Kaspar yet, so let's see what happens. There was chaos on board. It was no one's fault. The crew of the Carpathia were doing their best, but they were overwhelmed. They were busy just coping as best they could. Whoever we asked, nobody seemed to have definite news of anyone. Lists of survivors were being compiled, we were told. Mr. Stanton asked the sailors repeatedly for news of his family, but there was no one who recognised their description. Every one of us on that ship was looking for someone. Many sat silent, already knowing the worst, lost in grief. Joyous reunions were few and far between. Fearful and hopeful, we went looking for Elizabeth and Mrs. Stanton and Kaspar. We searched the ship from bow to stern. They were nowhere to be found. We found bodies lying in the deck, though, wrapped in blankets. We checked those too. I came across one little girl, about the same age as Elizabeth, and was sure it was her at first, but it was not. We looked everywhere we could think of and asked again and again the same question. The last lingering hope left to us was they might still be out at sea on the lifeboat. The two of us went to the ship's rail, but all the lifeboats we saw floating around the ship were already empty. We scanned the sea all around, searched the horizon. There was nothing. At that moment of utter despair, we heard a yowling from behind us. We turned. There they were, all three of them, shrouded in blankets, only their faces showing. It was a strange and wonderful reunion for all of us. We stood there on deck for many long minutes, our arms around one another. It was during those moments that I really felt for the first time that I had in some way became one of them, one of the family. Crowded in a cabin below with other survivors, we slept and told our stories and slept again. Elizabeth and her mother owed that survival, they told us, to a small Japanese man who spoke no English and a brave French lady who fortunately spoke both Japanese and English, so she could translate. Through her, the Japanese man made it clear to everyone that they should do what he was doing and row. If they rowed, they would keep warm, he said, and keeping warm would save their lives. So that's what they did, taking it in turns all night long. Even Elizabeth rowed. She sat on the French lady's lap and rowed. Because of that wonderful man's example, Mrs. Stanton said not one of them had died of the cold in the lifeboat. His example and cheerfulness had kept their spirits up all through the longest, coldest night of their lives, and when they reached the Carpathia, he was the last out of the lifeboat. I knew even as she was telling us that it had to be little Mitch. I went searching for him at once and found him after a while on his own, looking out over the railings at the empty sea. We greeted each other as old friends, which, of course, after all, we certainly were. I was up on deck with little Mitch a few days later as the Carpathia steamed slowly into New York harbour. That was when we first set eyes on the Statue of Liberty. He turned to me with a big grin on his face and said just one word: America. And that was how Kaspar and I came to America. As stowaways, as survivors from the Titanic. When we docked in New York, we came down the gangplank of the Carpathia together, the Stanton family and Kaspar and me. Mr. Stanton had a discussion, as he called it, with the immigrant authorities, and as a consequence of this, I was allowed to go and stay with them in their house in Greenwich Village. From the very start, I was treated as if I was one of them, and I was told I would never again call them Mr. Stanton and Mrs. Stanton, no more sir or madam. It would be Robert and Anne from now on. I found this a bit difficult at first, old habits die hard, but it became ever more natural as the weeks passed. But then Elizabeth fell sick, very sick. The terrible cold of that night on the ocean had reached her lungs. She caught pneumonia. The doctor came often to begin with, a taciturn man who did little to relieve our anxiety. Kaspar stayed with her all through her illness, scarcely ever leaving her bed. All the rest of us would take it in turns to sit with her. Then one morning I came in, and she was sitting on bed with Kaspar in her lap, smiling at me. She was her sunny self again. But for some time afterwards, she had to stay in her room and rest. But she didn't care for that at all, not one bit. There she is, snuggled up with Kaspar. Ah, she's got a dog and a cat on her bedding. She obviously likes animals. Elizabeth claimed that it had to be Kaspar who had brought luck to all of us. Because of Kaspar, she said, they had survived the night in the boat, and because of Kaspar, she had survived her pneumonia. I had a big argument with her about that. As much as I loved Kaspar, I never much believed in superstitions. You might as well say, I told her, that it was Kaspar who brought us bad luck in the first place. The worst luck, that maybe it was because Kaspar was on board that the Titanic had sunk in the first place. Nonsense, Elizabeth retorted. It was an iceberg, not Kaspar, that sank the Titanic. I think I discovered then, if I hadn't before, that I could never have an argument with Elizabeth and expect to win. That, one way or another, she would always have the last word. During Elizabeth's convalescence, that means, well, she gets better, stays in bed and gets better, has to stay very still and calm. During Elizabeth's convalescence, when she still wasn't allowed out of the house, I got to know Robert and Anne a great deal better. It took a while for me to feel completely at ease with them when we were alone, and I think they sensed it. They took it upon themselves to give me a good time, to show me New York. We went to Penn Station, visited the Statue of Liberty and the zoo, all of which made Elizabeth very jealous, and once we went collecting horseshoe crab shells on a beach on Long Island. Best of all, I learnt to ride with Anne in Central Park. She took me riding almost every day. I hadn't been on a horse before, so I had a lot to learn, but Anne was full of encouragement. You ride so well, Johnny, she told me once. As if you'd been born in the saddle. I'm very proud of you. The truth is, I loved being with them whatever we were doing. I felt as if I was a son for the first time. Having a mother and father of my own was better than I had ever imagined it could be. I was having the time of my life. In the evenings, I'd be up in Lizzie-Beth's room, playing with Kaspar if he was awake, and learning how to play chess with Elizabeth when he wasn't. I liked chess, although I never managed to win a single game against her. As for Kaspar, he had the run of the place as I did, and very soon had occupied the piano in the drawing room and made it his own. There's Kaspar playing chess. Meow, meow, meow. Everyone in the house, Elizabeth's governess, the servants too, all simply adored him. Like me, he couldn't have been happier. Only one cloud hung over me, the knowledge that sooner or later these days would have to end, and I'd have to leave. How I dreaded that day. One evening, some months afterwards, I was called down into the drawing room to find the family all lined up in front of the fireplace. Elizabeth was in her dressing gown. Kaspar was sitting on the piano watching me, his tail swishing. Elizabeth was looking at me conspiratorially. Clearly she knew something I didn't. Her mother and father, on the other hand, were looking very serious and stiff, rather as they had been when I first seen them that time back at the Savoy Hotel. This is it. I thought, this is when they tell me that my time is up, that I have to go back to London, to my job as a bellboy in the Savoy. Robert cleared his throat. He was going to make some kind of speech. I prepared myself for the worst. Johnny, the three of us have come to a decision, he began. You know how much we've enjoyed having you with us here as our guest. Elizabeth has told us of your circumstances back home in England, that you have no family as such to go back to. He hesitated, and that was when Anne spoke up. I guess what we're trying to say, Johnny, is that after all that has happened, and knowing you now as well as we do, what a fine young man you are, we would very much like you to consider not returning to London, but instead staying here and making your home with us in New York. We'd be really proud to have you live here as one of the family. If you'd like it, that is. What do you say? I remember Kaspar and Elizabeth both looking up at me, waiting for me to say something. It took me a while. Not to make up my mind, I did that instantly, but to get over my surprise and find my voice. "Oh, come on, Jolly Trot, say yes, please," Elizabeth cried. "Okay," I replied. It was a new expression I picked up in New York. I was so overwhelmed that it was all I could bring myself to say, but it was enough. Everyone hugged me then, and we all cried a little, except Kaspar, who had sprung up on the piano and was busy washing himself. So, by the greatest of good fortune, I acquired a new life, a new home, and a new country. They sent me back to school, which at first I didn't care for. I thought I'd finish with all that. I'd never been much good at books and reading and all that, but Robert read stories to us in the evenings, and through him I came to like books a lot better than I had. Gradually, school became much easier and sometimes even enjoyable. They teased me a bit at first on account of my London Cockney accent, and so to start with I felt a bit alone, but someone had put it about that I was a survivor from the Titanic, and after that I had all the friends I could handle. We spent long summers in Maine, sailing up there on the Abe Lincoln. Elizabeth and I went walking in the woods and fishing, and everywhere we went Kaspar came with us. They were great days I shall remember my whole life. I was to have gone off to college to William and Mary in Virginia, I'll start that sentence again. I was to have gone off to college to William and Mary in Victoria, where Robert himself had once been a student. But I never got there. In Europe, the First World War was raging, and my old country was fighting for her life. So, when in 1917 America sent troops to fight in France, I went with them. And who did I find marching alongside me up to the front? Little Mitch! We just picked off where we'd left off all those years before on the Titanic and on the Carpathia, and we were best friends from then on. While I was at the front, I'd get letters every week from Elizabeth, who was away at boarding school by now. I look forward to every one of them, because I can hear her voice and her writing. I see her face as I'm reading her words, and that cheered me more than I can say. When all around me in France I saw nothing but horror and death, this book is a delight. And with her letters, Elizabeth would sometimes send me little sketches, and once a beautiful drawing of Kaspar sitting there looking at me, willing me to come home, it seemed. Sorry, there's a picture here of him looking at one of the pictures that Elizabeth sent him, or reading a letter maybe, in the trenches during the war. I kept it with me in my tunic pocket, along with a photograph of her and me by the seashore in Maine. Elizabeth always said afterwards, when the war was over, that it must have been the drawing of Kaspar that kept me safe and brought me home. I'm not sure she was right about that, but she insisted on having it framed and put in pride of place on the front hall. When no one's looking, I do reach out and touch it sometimes, so I suppose I must be just a little superstitious, but I'm not admitting that to her. Right after the war, Mitch came to work with me in Robert's publishing business. He had become quite a family friend by now. We worked together in the packing room in the basement. Robert said we had to learn the business from the bottom upwards, so we did, literally. For me, books became a part of my life. I didn't just pack them, I read them, and very soon I began to write stories of my own. And while I was writing, Elizabeth would be up in her attic studio drawing or painting or sculpting, animals mostly. On our holidays in Maine, we wouldn't climb trees anymore or go diving off into the quay. She'd sit out on the rocks by the seashore with her sketchbook, and I'd scribble away nearby. And Kaspar would wander between us to remind us he was there. We would often talk of the old days in London, of Mr. Freddy and Skullface, and the Great Roof Rescue. And more than once she said what fun it would be to go back to visit. But I didn't think she was serious. Then, just before her 17th birthday, she announced to us that she was too old now to be given birthday presents. Instead, she was going to give us something, providing, she added, that we didn't mind giving it away. None of us quite knew what to make of this until she took us out into the front hall, and there, sitting on the table, below the famous sketch she had sent out to me in France during the war, was a magnificent sculpture of Kaspar. His neck arched, his tail curled around him. I carved him out of ash wood, she said, and then I painted it jet black. It's quite cool. Ow. And do you know what I want? I want to take it back to London and give it to the hotel where we stayed, where I first saw Kaspar and Johnny. I want it to be there forever. It's where Kaspar belongs. Kaspar could come too. He may be old, but he's as fit as a fiddle. Well, she said, beaming at us, when do we go? We went 6 months later, and little Mitch came with us too. We wanted him to come, to show him where it had all happened, where the whole story had begun, a story he was part of, that had changed all of our lives forever. I won't pretend that any of us enjoyed the crossing of the Atlantic. There were too many terrible memories, but we kept them to ourselves and never once mentioned the Titanic. In fact, we had hardly ever mentioned the Titanic in all these years. It was what bound us inseparably and what distanced us from others who had not been there, but we had rarely spoken about it among ourselves. All together again on the wide Atlantic, we faced our fears and took strength from one another's silence. Mr. Freddy was there to greet us at the front door of the Savoy, and when we went inside, the staff were waiting to welcome us. Kaspar yelled from his basket as they all clapped us in. So I took him out to show everyone. He loved all the attention, and to tell the truth, so did I. Mary O'Connell was still there, head housekeeper now, instead of Skullface. She gave Anne a huge bunch of red roses and cried on my shoulder as she hugged me. As the bellboy who took us up in the lift... I think it should be as for, there's a typo. As for the bellboy who took us up in the lift, he was a Cockney lad just like me, wearing the same uniform, with his cap warm at the same jaunty angle. He showed us into the Countess Kandinsky's rooms, with windows looking out over the Thames down towards the Houses of Parliament. Kaspar made himself at home at once, resuming his place on the piano and proceeding to wash himself vigorously. He was as happy as I had ever seen him. All those people. There they are, in the Savoy. Just another couple of pages. Sorry, I know this chapter's a bit longer. He slept on the window ledge in the sun all the rest of that day. He'd been doing a lot of sleeping lately. We had an unveiling ceremony outside the American bar the next morning, and much to Elizabeth's delight, everyone seemed to like the sculpture as much as they liked Kaspar himself. He was there at the ceremony, but wandered off during the speeches. I watched him go, waving his tail as he went. It was the last I ever saw of him. He just disappeared. Everyone searched the hotel over and over again, from the basement to the attic corridor, but he was nowhere to be found. It's well enough known that old cats go off to die when they're good and ready. I think, and Elizabeth thinks, that's what he must have done. We were sad, of course we were. He was the cat that had brought us together, had survived with us, and he was gone, but in a way, as I told Elizabeth, trying to comfort her, he's not gone. He's there, sitting proudly outside the American bar. You can go in and see him for yourself if you like. He's still there, looking very pleased with himself, and so he should be. After all, he is Prince Kaspar Kandinsky, Prince of Cats, a Muscovite, a Londoner, and a New Yorker, and, as far as anyone knows, the only cat to survive the sinking of the Titanic. There we go. Hold on. There's an extra bit, a little tidbit. Only a year or so after our visit to London, we received a letter from Mr. Freddy. Dear Johnny and Elizabeth, I am writing to tell you of a strange happening. Several guests at the hotel have reported sighting a black cat wandering the corridors late at night. I took no notice at first, but it has happened time and time again. I thought you ought to know. And yesterday, a lady staying in your rooms, the Countess Kandinsky's rooms, reported seeing a reflection in the mirror of a grand lady in an ostrich-feathered hat, carrying a black cat in her arms. When she was offered the opportunity to be moved to another room, she said she'd rather stay, that they were kindly ghosts, like good companions. Mary and the others send love. Come and see us again one day before too long. Yours, Freddy. Well, that's the end of Kaspar, Prince of Cats. Bit sad in places, but I guess a happy ending in the end.